Hey guys, it's Kim here, and I'm coming to you from my office. Bit of an office day today. I'll be shooting out to the beach a little bit later because it's such a nice day. I can't wait to get out there. But I wanted to talk about a lot of stuff that's coming up today, in particular, an awareness around power and the concept around power, and also how it affects the greater community, if you want to call it, both within a personal power and also a communal collective power. And also we'll be going into a little bit about consciousness and what is consciousness and thinking, like what is the difference, what they are, and going into a little bit about that. So I'll just go into an awareness that we had this morning, talking a little bit about pretty much our power of choice. And when we're talking about power of choice, what that actually ultimately means is being humans on this planet. One kind of thing that we signed up for was that we have free will. So we do have the power of choice, particularly when we are operating from a third dimensional mindset or consciousness. What we're actually doing is we're not actually honoring our free will of choice, and as soon as we honor our free will of choice, we do actually step up to another level of consciousness, which then gives us, in reality, more choices, which is probably what we want to do. When we really honor our capacity to choose, what then happens is we have a lot of paradigms, a lot of belief patterns and systems from our upbringing, but also from what society tells us, which actually says that the choices that you make have to go in alignment with what you're told. The thing is, and if I can just explain this, is that isn't really resonating with a lot of people, because a lot of us have really big decisions to make on our life right now at the moment, with work, family, relationships, all that sort of thing. We all know deep down inside what our truth is, but the thing is that we've been taught something opposite. So when we step into our free will of choice, we are then having a tug of war, if you want to call it, between, well, do I choose what I've been taught to be right, or do I choose in what I know to be right? And again, there's actually no right or wrong in any of this, because in actual fact, everyone's right or wrong is different, and there is no level of truth either, because everyone's truth is different. And this is where to move on as a society, we need to honor everyone's truth as their own. So this is where, when we're making a choice, we do have the more power when we make a level of choice from a place of our own truth. And we need to acknowledge the difference between our own truth and the truth that we've been taught growing up. You definitely will know the difference, because one will feel good and the other won't feel good. So feeling into our capacity to choose, and as we step more into these higher or different levels of experiences with the power to choose, what we don't realize is that power to choose can actually change the world. And whenever we step into our level of choice, what we are then doing is actually then putting out into the world. It's like a ripple effect when we make a choice. So say, for example, I'm just giving one example. Say, for example, you decide to not to eat meat, or you decide to not buy a newspaper, or you decide whatever decision you want to make around purchasing, and I call it purchasing power. So that's one person making a choice around what they want to buy. Now, you might not think that one person actually has any impact on the world, but then when that one person impacts another person, or another person feels the same way as that other person, and they then decide not to buy that product, and then another person and another person, in actual fact, the whole collective group of people then can actually change the world through their purchasing power, because companies will not exist unless someone buys their product. So what I'm saying with this is that, you know, there are people out there that think that we don't have an impact in the world and that we can't really do anything about what's happening. But there needs to be, say, for example, the guns, there needs to be someone buying the guns, which comes from a place of, you know, fear and protection, which, you know, when we connect to our inner soul, we realize we don't actually need that. But this is where, when we play around with these concepts and we look at all these things that are being fed by other belief patterns or whatever, we realize once we align with our own truth and we know the truth within ourselves, and then we act from that place as a collective, we actually have control on the world. We have control over everything. We have control over to what products are put out there. We have control over what we collectively eat, what type of food is out there. We have control over everything because of the supply and demand process. If you've done economics, you'll realize that there has to be a demand for supply to exist. So if you're not happy about something in the world, how about you go about changing the demand for that thing, whether it's through knowledge, education, or, I don't know, simple, you know, health, or whatever it is for you. Know that you can have an impact simply by choosing not to buy. And then it's not getting other people to choose not to buy as well, but connecting to other people who just choose not to buy. And then collectively you will have power over that. I'd love to see some examples. I might even Google, and if anyone wants to Google and pop below some examples of how people have actually changed the world through buying power or purchasing power. I'd love to hear from it. But also the other thing that came to my awareness today was also the power of women. And as we're stepping more into the rise of the feminine and the goddess again, we actually don't really understand how much power we have. Because if we decide today to not have any more children, we actually can stop the whole population and stop the species, because they literally cannot produce a child without a woman. Can you see as a woman how much power you have as a woman? I'm blown away by that awareness that came through today. Not that we would ever do that, but I think we need to honor and be aware of how much power we actually have in this species actually continuing on. I just want you to just let that soak in, because if we all decide as women to not have any more children anymore, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I just want you to acknowledge that if we ever did that, this species would not continue without us. So that is pretty powerful within itself. Okay, another question that I've been given by a client was, what is the difference between consciousness? Like, what is consciousness and what is thinking, and are they the same thing or different? So, and it was great because I had another chat with another client who then enabled me to, I always get the information from talking to others, because as I'm talking to others, it just comes through. And that's why all my live events that are coming up, I need this interaction with other people to be asking me the questions and coming up with the answers. I'll come up with again, they're not the answers, they're just another way of looking things. So this is where, you know, the question, what is our consciousness and what is thinking and what is the difference? And I was able to talk to a client where we actually worked exactly out what the difference is. So there is like a cycle, and consciousness and thinking is actually a cycle of processes. But within that cycle, there is another element, which is awareness. So if we look at thinking, which is what we do with our physical brain, and then if you look at, okay, so thinking is possibly what most people are aware of and what they know of. So if you need to think about that, or you need to remember that, or whatever, that is possibly what most people, or all that most people know. Then if we go into consciousness and saying, okay, so I'm aware that that person's treating me in a certain way, or I'm aware that this is an issue for me, or I'm aware of whatever, you can actually see that there's the thinking, but then there's the awareness, which then steps into consciousness, which is I'm now So consciousness is actually awareness, and that's all awareness, consciousness is. So if you're trying to go, well, what is the difference between consciousness and thinking? Consciousness is just awareness and knowing. Thinking is using your brain to think. Now, as I've played around with this, and I've done some research around thinking, technically because I have learnt not to think anymore, I could pretty much be shown or given anything, asked anything, and I can literally receive the answer. It won't make sense to me, but I will literally receive the answer without thinking, because I have, and we all have access to universal wisdom. So I never really understood why we need to think or even store stuff in here in my poor family. And like, I live off lists because I just do not store anything in my head, because I'm constantly receiving universal wisdom as to what I need to know, what other people need to know to move forward. And again, that's where we live our life guided, because we're always given our next steps. But then what happens is, I often question, why do we think? And I looked into some brain scans around the difference between what happens when we think and what happens when we literally receive universal guidance from wherever it comes from. And in actual fact, the brain behaves quite differently when it's thinking as opposed to when it's receiving. And technically, when we're receiving information, it does actually allow the brain to, if you want to call it, relax a lot more, and do its job, which what I believe the brain's job is, to run our human bodies. Like, that's our brain's job, is to run this physical body. We do have access to a universal mind or a universal wisdom, which gives us everything else that we need to know. So this is where we can play around with these two energies, which is the thinking, and the receiving, which is the consciousness. And that consciousness is simply like this total awareness of what's going on. And it is from a different level of awareness. But it can be quite a cycle, because you have the thinking, which then creates the awareness, which then creates the consciousness, which then creates the thinking, which creates the awareness, and then the consciousness. So they all play in with each other. But especially last night, and with a lot of changes in my life coming up, I found myself going into thinking again, which, as soon as we go into thinking, we actually go into worry, fear, overwhelm, anxiety, stuff like that, because you're giving your brain something else to do, which is not running your body, and which then changes how your body reacts. And so your body goes into the fight or flight, because it doesn't know what else to do when it's faced with something. As soon as you decide, again, going into choice, decide to choose this is where that thinking comes in, because you have the thinking, and then you have an awareness. There's an awareness to say, this thinking is creating anxiety. This thinking is creating nervousness. This thinking is creating whatever it's creating. You can then step into that awareness that doesn't feel good, or that's not great. So then you shift into another level of consciousness, which is almost like the big picture. What's really going on here? Well, I'm freaking out about something that's going to happen in a month's time. Do I really need to focus on that right now? No, because right now I'm laying in bed going to sleep. So consciousness is almost truth. It's the big picture. And so we can technically run our lives from consciousness. And the more expansive we allow our consciousness to go, which again is that awareness of life and the universe and spirituality. This is what my branding is. The more we know about that, the less you realize we actually need to think, because thinking doesn't really need to exist in this current reality. We can literally receive whatever we need to receive. So I hope that kind of explains the difference between consciousness and thinking, and then there's also awareness thrown in there. I also like to throw in observation. Observation is a really powerful way to slip into consciousness. And consciousness, I'm not sure if you've seen like films like Limitless or whatever. They are actually totally conscious. There's actually not a lot of thinking involved in that they're actually opening up all the channels. And this is where, when I was talking to my client, it's like our channels get blocked with thinking in our brain. If we are actually open to receiving, it's actually sending stuff through. And you'll see through films like Limitless and whatever, they take pills to get that level of consciousness. But you can do it without actually taking medication, connecting to that higher level of consciousness. When you're receiving, you're clearing the channels, you're receiving, and you're able to get more information than what can be stored in here. So if you want to call it a big computer or a big brain that's up there, we do have access to that. Everyone has access to that. If we just allowed that information to come through and stopped all that thinking, which doesn't need to exist. The other thing I wanted to say is, yes, all this theory is great, and it helps us in this very moment when we get this message, but how do we remember this stuff? So again, talking to a client, I just got the thought, I'm going to, because I can't wear jewelry because my skin's just sensitive to metal. So I said, I'm going to get a gold or a bronze I've got this stuff here from back my wedding planning days. And I'm just going to put this on my arm, and I'm just going to allow that to remind me that I am an infinite soul in a body having an experience, and to then connect more so with the level of consciousness and universal wisdom, rather than going into the human thinking, which then creates all the problems that we all have. So this is a great awareness, and it's actually on my arm as a reminder of the big picture, pretty much, and who we really are. So if you guys, I used to joke and say I'm going to get tattoos made or whatever else, but this actually is a lot easier. I actually think it looks quite cool. And it's gold because when we connect to ourselves as infinite beings and souls within a body, we are kind of gold and sparkly. If you've ever been able to travel in that dimension and that level, we are quite gold and sparkly, and that's how we look as energy. It's quite beautiful. So this is representative of us as gold and sparkly, and representative of us being in the universe and at one with the universe. They're my ramblings for today. I know there's a little bit in there, but I just can't break things down into individual bits and pieces. I've just got to share stuff as it comes through. Any questions or anything, pop them below. Otherwise, I'll see you again tomorrow. Bye.